Good evening. My name is Josh Sussman from the Nefesh Marketing and Programming team. Thank you for joining us. I am happy to be joined by our longtime partners and friends, Jane Ullman, who will be presenting this evening, and on the back end, Yair Givati, who will be helping to answer the Q&A. This session is being recorded. We will send it out in the next 24 to 48 hours, along with the PowerPoint presentation and a few other resources, contact information for Jane and Yair. And you will receive everything if you register for this event. So don't worry about the contact information or writing down quick notes. Everything will be sent to you. Anything that we share will be included in that email. Please put all your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat. We will use the chat to send information out to you. But it's much easier to manage the Q&A in the Q&A format, not in the chat. So please do that. And with that said, I will pass on to Jane. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening or good morning. Well, I guess good evening. Most people are in Israel, I assume, watching this. This is the next in our series of webinars relating to property in Israel, buying property or renting property in Israel. This evening's presentation is going to focus more on first-time buyers who are already in Israel, mostly people who perhaps are already renting and buying their first place. So therefore, it's a lot more focused on people who have already been living in Israel for a while and kind of understand a little bit about how it works and a bit of the lingo, but need to understand the process more in depth. As Josh explained, I'm going to be giving the overview of the lecture. And Yair Givati, who is another real estate lawyer with an office in Jerusalem, is going to be furiously answering the questions on the back end. In that way, we try to get through as much information as possible. The presentation, the PowerPoint for the presentation will be available after the lecture. So if you miss something, don't worry, you can go back and review the PowerPoint. So feel free to ask your questions and Yair will try to get to the answers. And if anything gets missed, both of our emails will be shared several times, I'm sure, during the answers to the questions, and you're free to email either myself or Yair Givati with regards to other questions that didn't get answered. So let's begin. First, a little bit about myself. I'm an Israeli trained attorney. I studied at Bar Ilan for law. I'm originally from California. I made Aliyah after my first degree. I'm an attorney for over 20 years. I have an office in Jerusalem with my partner, Aryeh Racklin, and our main focus is real estate law. We also do wills and estates, small business, things like that. But real estate is really our bread and butter. So let's begin with where you start. Most people, when they start looking around to buy a property, feel really, really overwhelmed. And so the purpose of this lecture and also our advice in general to you is to try to help you streamline that process and understand how to get the information so that you feel like you're making an informed decision. It doesn't have to feel like your head is imploding or exploding as this picture shows. And the more knowledge that you have and the more that you understand the process, the more you'll be able to feel like you know the questions to ask and to get the information that you need. In general, we have 3 basic tips for success. I always tell my clients that they need to lose their expectations. People come from a different country, or you have this idea of how you think things should work. That is only going to cause you aggravation and chafing at the system which exists in Israel. So you need to put that aside a little bit and embrace the fact that in Israel, things work in a different way, and go with how things work. The next is know what resources are available. That means that you have to know what kind of due diligence you can do and what kind of checks are available to make sure that you understand what it is that you're buying. That's part of the purpose of this lecture, to help inform you. And the third is to build yourself a team. All of the due diligence cannot be performed by one person. Even if you have a fantastic lawyer, there are things that are not in that lawyer's realm of expertise, and we may need to bring in other professionals to help you build a complete picture to make an informed decision. Part of the purpose of this lecture is also to explain to you what resources are available and who are the potential players on your team. Okay, the first element is checking registration. registration in Israel is not in one central tidy registration body. You'll hear words thrown around in Hebrew, the tabu or the minhal or a chevra meshakenet, things like that. And agents oftentimes will tell you that it's a benefit. Oh, something's already in the tabu. What does that mean? When property is being built by a contractor, in the first stages, the rights to the land and to the building are owned by the contractor, and they sell them on to you. So for the first few years while the building is being built and after the building is even completed, the rights are with the construction company, who then becomes like a mini registration company known as a chevra meshakenet. That's the third one down on that list. It doesn't mean that it's not legal registration. It just means it's in a limbo from when it was first built to when it becomes individually registered as individual units in the tabu. The tabu is the Ottoman word for the lands registry. So you'll hear lands registry or tabu. Tabu is actually not Hebrew. It's the Ottoman word, but it's kind of the vernacular that's used. The benefit of something being in the tabu means that it just has less bureaucracy. And in the lands registration, there's a whole file with the files, with the elements of the file for that building, meaning that the whole building is registered as a condo, and it shows which apartments belong to each person, which parking space, which storage room, and there are sketches. And there are bylaws of that condo to see, for instance, if all of the roof rights would belong to a certain apartment. All of that would appear in the file in the tabu. Therefore, it's considered beneficial if things are registered in the tabu. However, legally, it's not necessarily a deterrent if you're buying a property that's not in the tabu. If it's in the chevra meshakenet, the registration company, all that means is that we have to do the transfer of rights and we have to get the title documents from that company. And it's more work, meaning we have to make sure that we get the plans that were signed with that and with the original purchase. And we have to ascertain what the rights were. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a process. It's just you have to understand what stage it's in. Another option that you'll hear is the minhal. Israel historically has more than one registration body that can govern land. And there are certain areas which have always been governed by a different office called the Lands Administration. And that is known as the minhal. And those properties can be either together with the registration company, together with the chevra meshakenet, or just the minhal. There's a different minhal for areas in the Yeshuvim, in Yehuda v'Shomron, that's called minhal yosh. And those are long-term leasehold. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you're only leasing your property. It means that the land underneath the property isn't straight ownership rights, but rather it's a long-term lease of usually 49 years with an additional automatic extension. And that has allowed historically for the state of Israel to control who buys up the land. There are some not so PC undertones, if everyone understands what I mean, but the state of Israel historically has wanted to control who is able to purchase the land in Israel to make sure that it stays in the hands of the people that they want it to stay in. So therefore, there have been certain areas of the country that have always been administered by the Lands Administration. So you'll hear all of those words, minhal, chevra meshakenet, tabu, minhal yosh. All of those places can be different places where you'll see registration, and it doesn't necessarily mean that any of them are legally problematic, but it's one of the things that your lawyer has to check. Let's check registration. After they've checked registration and it seems like, okay, that registration for where it's registered makes sense. It's registered in the seller's name. It's, if it's an apartment that's 100 meters, it doesn't appear all of a sudden as 19 meters. And the rest of it is actually a storage room. These are the kind of crazy things that we'll see. That's the first element of checking. Where is it registered? And is the registration reflective of the property that you're buying? So again, once we checked where it's registered, you're checking what is registered. Is it ownership, straight ownership, or long-term leasehold, as I was just mentioning? Is it a private house, or is it an apartment, a unit within a building which has a condominium type registration? What kind of additional spaces? A lot of times, for instance, you'll hear an agent, and I have a good relationship with agents. It's just that I check everything that's told to me, even if I have the best agent working with me. If they tell you, oh yeah, you have these 2 parking spaces are yours, it needs to appear on the registration that those 2 spaces are dedicated to this apartment. Because sometimes there's kind of a gentleman's agreement within the parking area, for instance, that everyone can use spaces and it's not actually yours. For instance, you might also have use of a garden that's been unofficial for years, but it's not actually attached to your apartment. So those are the kind of things that we check when we're checking the registration. The other few things that we would check on registration, are there any liens? Does the seller have a mortgage? All those things should be showing up on the registration, and it allows us to understand the full picture of what we're buying. What kind of space is it registered as? Is it residential space? That's important. Sometimes in the older areas of Jerusalem, you'll find small apartments that were actually not really meant to be apartments, and they've been always used as apartments, but their actual registration is for a storage space or other things. And that can be very problematic if you need a mortgage and things like that. So the registration needs to be checked. Additionally, unused rights. If you are told that there's definitely rights to build out another room, we would want to see whether or not those rights exist. You won't be able to see it from the registration, but we're going to talk about how those things are checked. Okay, after we've kind of looked at the registration, we get to the contract negotiation. Now, how does the whole process work? In general, you've looked at a property and you make an offer through an agent. The agent helps you work out the business terms. Business terms as price, payment schedule, the date of possession. Those are kind of the things that the agent often helps. Not always payment schedule, definitely price and the date of possession. Once you've kind of had those elements come into your offer and the offer is accepted, then the seller's lawyer sends out to your lawyer as a buyer a contract. And at that point, that's kind of where the games begin. We have a contract and we start negotiating the terms of the contract in tandem with doing all the rest of our due diligence, which is checking the registration and the other items that we're going to get to. So in the business terms of the contract, when we're getting to the contract negotiation, again, we want to talk about price, payment schedule, the date of possession, included extras. That means that what kind of contents are included. Houses and apartments in Israel are sold totally stripped. So that means that you shouldn't assume that you're getting appliances, for instance. You shouldn't assume that you're getting the closets that are there. Anything according to the law that's not permanently affixed does not have to be left in the apartment. So in order to avoid misunderstandings, we as lawyers try to make as specific as a list as possible. That doesn't mean you have to write down toilets and floor tiles, but you do have to write closets, or I always even write kitchen cupboards, air conditionings. It seems obvious, but those things are not necessarily taken for granted that they're included, and we don't want to have any misunderstandings about what's included. Similarly, we don't want them to leave you a bunch of junk at the end and say, oh, I just left you that stuff as a favor, when you don't really want that stuff, and then you have to pay someone to take it out. So you want the contents list to be specific about the things that you really do want, and anything that's not on that list should not be left in the apartment when you take possession. Additionally, we would include whether or not any repairs would be made. And the rule of thumb really is that sellers don't make very many repairs. And we're going to get to how that comes in when we get to building your team. But oftentimes, if you bring in an engineer, they will give you a report of possible repairs that you could make or defects which exist in the apartment. And sometimes it comes into the business terms that the seller will agree to make certain repairs as part of the deal. So if that is the case, that also needs to come into the equation. Now, again, this contract negotiation, this stage is really for buying secondhand and not buying on paper. Buying on paper is a different, it's a different kettle of fish. It's a different species. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But right now we're really talking about if you're buying an apartment that already exists, which they lovingly refer to in Israel as buying secondhand. Okay. What are the other elements of the contract? The legal terms. Okay, the legal terms in the contract include the declarations by the seller. They have to declare that they're the legal owner and that they have the right of possession and that they don't know of any hidden defects, and items of that nature. In general, it is the buyer's responsibility to do all due diligence, meaning that the seller has an obligation to disclose to you any fundamental issue regarding the apartment which might affect your decision. But at the end of the day, the real onus and the burden for doing all of your due diligence is on you, because you would have to prove that he knew something and didn't disclose it to you, which is very difficult to do. So that means you have to do all of your due diligence before we sign the contract. There are no contingencies in contracts in Israel. Once you sign, you're in. So that means you give your offer, and then we get the contract, and we do all of our due diligence. We gather all of our information, and if we like the deal, we sign it. And once you sign, you're in. That means that we have to make sure that we know what we're buying, which brings me to the next things on the list. There is no financing contingency in Israel. What does that mean? If you need a mortgage, you have to make sure that you're approved for the mortgage before you sign the contract. And the mortgage approval needs to also be specific, if possible, to this property. That's especially important if you're buying in some of the yeshuvim. Not all banks like to give loans for certain yeshuvim. And so you need to make sure that the bank is willing to loan you the amount that you think that you need for that property. There's also, as I was mentioning, no repairs contingency. So you have to make sure that you understand the state of the apartment that you're buying. The general rule is that a seller has to give you the apartment on the date of possession in the same condition as it was when you signed the contract, minus normal wear and tear. And you, on your side, as a buyer, sign, I agree to buy it as is. And it generally says it in big English letters, as is. So in order to understand what that as is, it's recommended to bring an engineer and do a full report so that you can understand what it is that you're buying. It's important, even if the seller isn't making any repairs, as I was stating, because it's budgetary. Let's say that you're buying an apartment for 2 million shekels, and it turns out that there's 50,000 shekels of essential repairs. Your price now is essentially 2,050,000. And that is important for you in your decision-making process. So because we haven't yet signed the contract, if the repairs are more than you expected, and the seller is not willing to perform any of the repairs or reduce the price, which is unusual for them to reduce the price, at that point, you would have to make the decision whether or not you still like this deal for the price of 2,050,000. Okay, there are also penalties for delay and breach. The timelines that you set in the contract are important. Sometimes I have clients who kind of take it as a suggestion or a guideline, and they're not really careful to make sure that they've got all their payments lined up in time. The penalties are intense, meaning that the first 7 days generally are a grace. And if you're over 7 days late, but not always, by the way, but if you're over 7 days late, then it becomes an interest payment. And generally after 14 days, and sometimes only 7, you would be in fundamental breach of the contract. Fundamental breach of the contract in Israel carries generally between a 10 to 15% penalty of the purchase price. So it's something that you definitely want to avoid. I can say that I've had it happen very few times amongst my clients. Generally, we try to arrange something, but it's not something that you can just let flow. You have to make sure when you're setting the payment schedule that that is a payment schedule that you can definitely fulfill with regards to the availability of your money and how fast you can get out the mortgage. So you need to make sure that you build the payment schedule in such a way that it's doable. The next area that needs to come into the contract negotiation is illegal spaces. Now, that's known in Israel as charigot b'niyah or charigot. You'll hear it talked a lot about because we all know, let's just face it, everyone that we know is built a little here, you close in the laundry room there, that merpeset is closed off, and you can see that a lot of places are actually built in such a way that it's obvious that those spaces are going to be closed in and used. The reason for that is that the zoning rules are quite strict, and the kablanim or the contractors know that people want more space, and so they kind of build this little perfectly square merpeset right off the hallway which seems a bit random, but obviously it could make it into another room. By zoning laws, they're not allowed to sell that space as residential space, but they know it with a nod, nod, wink, wink that people are going to close it in. But it can create a problem down the road at a couple of different junctures. The biggest juncture is when you need to sell, because certain of the municipalities or the iriot send out an inspector and they won't give you the clearances that you need in order to sell if you have those illegal spaces. And the other is when you're buying, it can be a problem because it can affect your appraisal. When you take a mortgage, you must get an appraisal, and the appraisal will the appraiser will not be able to take into account any spaces which do not have a proper legal permit. Why is that important? Because the bank lends their money based on either the appraisal or the contract value, the lower of the two. That means, let's say for easy, fantasy numbers, you're buying an apartment for 1 million shekel and you need a 70% mortgage. But because 2 of the bedrooms are actually built not with a permit, the appraisal comes in at 900,000 shekels instead of 1 million. You now have to come up out of your pocket with an additional 70,000 shekels in order to make up the difference. So it's important to understand whether or not the house is built according to the permits, especially in a situation in which you need a mortgage. Going just a little bit more about harigot, because people ask me a lot, what do I do? Again, if you're in Israel, you know that a lot of properties in Israel have harigot, and people, for the most part, are willing to live with it. But I tell my clients that not all harigot are created equal. And the truth is, this is not a legal solution, but the truth is that a lot of people play a cat and mouse game. If they have to cover it up in order to get their clearances, then they do so. And then after the area or the inspector goes away, they open it back up and use it. So that's doable if you're closing up a laundry room or you're closing up a little playroom that's off of the hallway. But if the person that you're buying from has put half their kitchen into a space which is meant to be a mirpeset, a balcony, or they put their kitchen into half of the space which was meant to be a shared area of the landing outside the stairwell, that's a really big deviation to try to have to fix. And that could be very, very expensive, and you basically have to rebuild the apartment. So in assessing, the risk level in any deviation, you kind of want to understand what is the deviation and how easily could I put it back if I needed to, because also policies can change down the line with the iriot. For instance, in Modi'in, once upon a time, they didn't care at all. And now with every single sale, they'll send out an inspector and they will not give you clearance if you have deviations from the permit. Okay, let's talk about physical due diligence, right? We talked about some of the things we're looking at, the registration and the illegal spaces, things like that. Physical due diligence is like, what are you doing with the actual space? So here's who can be on your team: an engineer who would come out again, and they inspect, and their job is to come up with every problem. And sometimes people get nervous from the report, but it's a little bit like buying a used car, right? The engineer has to tell you about every dent in the fender, and the air conditioning is a little weak, and there's a scratch over here. All those things are going to show up. It doesn't mean that you're not going to buy the apartment, because again, it's not brand new. But what we're looking for are major big ticket items that might change your decision to buy or not buy. So the engineering report needs to be done before you sign the contract. Planning expert comes in again, as I was saying, when you have a situation in which you need to know that whether or not you can add rights. 1 second, I just need to plug the computer in. So if there are additional rights that you need to make sure that exist because you've been told that they exist, and that's one of the reasons why you want that apartment, or you're not sure if it matches the permit, and you want to make sure that it doesn't have big harigot, that it doesn't have big deviations, at that point you pull out a planning expert. Planning expert is also the same person as an appraiser. They wear 2 hats. We don't always take them to perform both of those functions, but if you are doing an appraisal, they will also be able to give you a planning report. Sometimes we expand the scope of the planning report if we have specific questions. For instance, sometimes I have a client that wants to know, what are they building in that empty lot across the way? Because I only want to buy this if I'm going to still have a view, or they're not going to build a school or something like that because I don't want to deal with that. Then you would take a planning report, a planning expert to give you a report, again, before you sign the contract. An appraisal. When do you need an appraisal? If you are taking a mortgage, you will definitely need an appraisal. If you're buying secondhand. If you're buying firsthand, meaning off plans, you don't generally need to have an appraisal. If you're buying secondhand, you need an appraisal. And the question is whether or not you do it before or after signing the contract. The general rule of thumb is if you're taking upwards of 60% financing, it's worth you doing it before you sign the contract. The question is, why wouldn't someone do it before the contract? Doesn't that make sense? So in a weird fluke, the banks subsidize the appraisal costs if you do it after signing the contract. And for that reason, it's a bit cheaper to do it after you sign the contract, and people sometimes wait until they definitely need it. Or if you're taking the mortgage a bit down the road and you don't want the appraisal to be outdated, you might wait so that you don't have to do it twice. But if you're taking anywhere over 60% and anyway you're going to need an appraisal, I personally feel it's worth doing it before you sign the contract to make sure that there aren't any hidden surprises with, for instance, a low valuation or perhaps unpermitted space. The one thing about that is that you have to basically have an idea of the bank or banks that you might be taking the mortgage from to make sure that the appraiser you're going with appears on the list of those banks. Not every appraiser appears on every list. So therefore you want to try to take someone that appears on the lists of the banks that you're considering to make sure that you don't have to do it twice. Now, sometimes we want to take in an architect or a designer to make sure that how much it would cost or what kind of changes could be made. Not everyone has to do that before you sign the contract, but some people choose to. The specifications in the Mifrat, I'm going to leave that to I'm going to come to talking about buying on paper in a second. And the additional rights, again, I touched on that. That would become into with an appraiser. If a planning expert, if you think that there are additional rights and you definitely want this property only if you can build up the roof or dig out a basement or whatever, that's when you would be checking that out before you buy. Then the flip side of that, obviously, is illegal spaces. Okay, I'm going to go back here. I'm not sure that I have a slide on the, okay, I don't think I have a slide on this. Well, I'm going to go and take a stop here and go into buying on paper. So buying on paper is a bit different, and buying on paper means that you are buying a new apartment or a new house that is under construction from the contractor. Buying on paper, and I will have a flyer sent out with this. Josh is going to send out with the materials a flyer which sets out the stages of buying on paper, and a different flyer which sets out the stages of buying secondhand. But when you're buying on paper, basically the contract is made up of 3 parts. One is the legal contract, 2 is the plans, and the 3rd is the specs or the mifrat, which you see on this list. Now, the legal contract is what your lawyer reviews. It has it's about 30 to 50 pages, exactly how it works, all of the various clauses. It includes the payment schedule, all of those kinds of things. And we work hard to try to balance it, take out this word. We're looking also for the hidden money. How much things cost, make sure that we're balancing, your interests as much as possible. And don't believe any contractor that tells you can't make changes. I've never had a contract that can't be made changes with, except for unless you're buying with one of the schemes of what's called Mahir leMishtaken or Mahir leMatara, which are government kind of lottery projects. Those contracts are standard and we can't make changes. Other than that, there can be changes made to every single contract. I've never had it where we can't make changes, which will improve the contract in your favor. So while your lawyer is working on that contract, what happens is that you have the plans and the specs which need to be reviewed by you. And I always suggest using an architect or a designer. Why? The plans show this beautiful 4-bedroom apartment. Okay, and you go into the model apartment and you see that it looks fantastic. That doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're getting. The specs or the mifrat will explain to you what you're getting. Are you getting air conditioning or just prep, meaning like the duct work or the piping for an air conditioning? How many meters of kitchen cupboards are you getting, right? It might just be that you're getting such a little tiny small kitchen that included in the price that you have to add 50,000 shekels in order to make it usable for yourself. All these kinds of things. What is the level of tiling? You know, like some contractors give a very minimal spec and other contractors give a much more generous spec. And that again is a budgetary item. So while your lawyer is working out the legal contract and the legal provisions, we in tandem need to be working on the specifications and the plans. A lot of people ask me, okay, so will they make changes and additions? That really depends on your contractor. It runs the entire gamut. We have contractors, for instance, Dona, who builds a lot in Karmei Gat and Givat Shmuel, other places like that. And they do not add in anything over the specs that are standard. Anything that you want to do is made through what's called a changes order after you sign the contract. Other contractors are a bit hungrier maybe, and they are willing to add in some extras. They'll add in, I don't know, a double sink or better tiling or various things, and they can add those in to your specs. Anything like that has to be included in your contract or it doesn't exist. So what we would do as lawyers is we would get your wish list from either you or through your designer and say, please clarify the following 15 things, and please ask for all of these things to be included. And maybe they'll say yes, and maybe they'll say no. But again, that's a budgetary item for you to understand what's included when you're buying. And then we come to the stage, what happens if they say no, but you only want the apartment if for sure you can have that thing, like taking down that wall or moving that bathroom or something like that. So at that point, even if it's not going to be included in the price, we would ask them to give us a price quote and confirm that after we sign the contract, they would indeed be willing to make that change and for how much, so that you can make sure that that works for you. Because for instance, if you're buying an apartment and it only works for you if you can take down that wall and move the bathroom, but now you've already signed the contract, so you're already committed, and they say either no, or they say, sure, for 100,000 shekel, you're stuck. So if there's anything that's a stopper, an essential item that you need to make sure that they'll do for you, we need to make sure that they'll commit and give us a price before you buy. So that's basically the basic structure of how it works when you're buying on paper. You've got the contract and the plans and the specs. And once we get all of that negotiated, then we would go and sign the contract. Let's move on to money. Now, this is obviously the most crucial part of the lecture. I even wrote, I asked, did some market research, and I asked a few young people what their most pressing questions would be as first-time buyers, and almost all of them were money questions. So let's spend some time here. First of all, one of the major expenses beyond your price of your house is your purchase tax. Now, purchase tax in Israel is bracketed, meaning that it depends, each part of the price gets a different rate of tax. If you are an Israeli resident, meaning that your center of life is in Israel and you spend at least 183 days in the country, you're considered a resident, even if you don't have citizenship. Again, it goes by residency, not citizenship. If you're an Israeli resident and you are buying your first and your only residential property, meaning that you don't own any other residential properties in Israel, you have the most beneficial tax rate. That tax rate starts at 0% for the first 1.744 little bit million shekels, meaning if you're buying something for 1.7 million shekel, you would have no purchase tax. Over 1.744, there's a bracket of 3.5, then 5, 6, 7, 8 up. Okay, so if you are buying a property, for instance, for 2 million shekels, I did a simulation. As an Israeli resident buying your only residence, it would be 8,942 shekels for your purchase tax. That tax is due 60 days after you sign the contract. It doesn't matter if you're not getting the apartment for a long time, it's due 60 days after you sign the contract. If it's not your only apartment and you already had an apartment, or even maybe your parents bought an apartment in your name once upon a time, and this is your second apartment on paper, like technically, that same tax, instead of being just under 9,000 shekel, would now be 107,000 shekel 77. So it's not just double, it's a really big difference. So it's a big tax savings to be a first time or sole residence buyer. If you were buying a 4 million shekel residence, for instance, it would be 108,000 shekels if this was your only residence. And if it's not your only property and you're buying a second or more property, or you're not a residence, it would then be 228,309. I've asked Yair Givati to put up in the Q&A the basic brackets for the tax. And also there's a link to a simulator put out by the tax authority where you can kind of put in your different criteria, your different numbers, and you can crunch those numbers to see what your tax would be. Again, the tax as a standard is due 60 days after you sign. If you're buying new construction on paper, you actually can push that tax off until you've paid at least 50% of the purchase price, but it carries linkage and interest. So that can really crank up the tax really fast. So unless you have a real cash flow issue, you need to try to pay it by the 60-day mark. And also you cannot use mortgage money to pay that or any other soft costs. Now, so that's the purchase tax. The mortgage approval. How do you get mortgage approval? You work either with a bank or a mortgage broker. A lot of times people ask us, should I use a mortgage broker? My answer is yes, if you use a good mortgage broker. Anyone can walk into a bank and get you an approval. That's the easy part. The hard part is getting you a good loan that over the life of the loan is the most beneficial. Especially young couples really focus on your monthly repay, which is not always the smartest thing to do, because the monthly repay sometimes can be very front-loaded in interest or be expensive over the life of the loan. So you want someone that really understands your circumstances. Mortgages can also be made up of different pieces, meaning that let's say that right now you want to pay, you have a lower income, so you want to stretch it out, or maybe you think you're getting an inheritance or you have something that's coming up. You can kind of piece it together with different pieces. What are the basic mortgage rates? I get that question a lot. So I consulted one of my mortgage colleagues today to give me the most updated answer. Right now, the rates are between 3 and 4%, like a blended rate. Again, you put it together with different pieces. If you're taking 45% or less of the value of the property, that's where the lowest rates are. And the maximum rate right now you can get as an Israeli resident buying your only property is up to 75%. Now, mortgages work that you have to put in all of your your non-mortgage money before you can get the mortgage. That's the general rule. So if you're taking 75%, that means that you have to put in your 25% before you can get your mortgage. Typical down payments when you're buying secondhand is generally 20%, sometimes less, but generally people don't want to commit to selling you their house if you can't put down at least 20%. The payment schedule is constructed based on the availability of your funds and whether or not within the framework of your funds we have to pay off the seller's mortgage, or for instance, if you're renting and we want to try to backload. So our idea as when we're representing buyers is to try to push off as much as possible your payments, especially if you have to take a mortgage, but always give you the option to prepay if possible. That's important because especially if you're buying new construction, it can be a process of 2, 3, 4 years. And you would want to make sure that you don't have to pay before the farthest date possible, again, as close to the end as possible. But if all of a sudden, the mortgage rates are really low, or you have a little bit of money, you always want to be able to prepay. So it's important to negotiate into your contract the ability to prepay. And one of the other questions that I was asked about payments is, how does it work again with renting? That's kind of the way it works, that you want to try to push off your mortgage payment as much as possible to the end. There's also an option sometimes to get a few months grace from the bank, meaning that you would only pay the interest and you wouldn't have to pay back the principal of the loan, which gives you a bit more breathing room as far as how long it would take before you have to rent. So that's the idea, is to try to push off as much as possible the timing at which you would start have to paying rent, so that it will coincide for as short a period as possible with also paying, with paying the mortgage, as short as possible with paying the rent. Okay. You want to have the appraisal done again beforehand, so you can make sure that you have the right amount of financing. It depends on when your availability of funds. You need to work on getting your funds into Israel as we get closer to signing the contract. Do not wait until the contract is totally ready and then start moving funds into Israel if your funds are not already here. It takes a bit of time. The other thing is you must move money from an account in your name from outside of the country. You can sometimes move from your parents' name if you can show why they're giving you the money, but you do not want to be moving money from your uncle's account to you, or from a family trust account or a business account or things like that. The money laundering laws in Israel are very intense, and you don't want to get the money flagged or returned because you sent it from something that the bank cannot obviously see is connected to you. Okay, now, structuring the payments. Let's go back to structuring the payments. Structuring the payments when you are buying secondhand is, again, usually 10 to 20%, sometimes more, then some payments in the middle, and then a payment at the end. How does it work? People want to know, what do I get against my first payment to make sure that they're not going to run away with my money? So against the first payment in secondhand deals, you get a lien on the house. Depending on where the registration is, as we spoke earlier, that lien can either be in the tabu, in the lands registry, or in a second place that we register liens for any property that's not registered in the tabu. So what happens is you pay with a bank check, which is like cash, it's already gone out of your account. The seller's attorney holds it for a period of a couple of days. We run and register a lien in your favor, and then the money is released. So there's never any money released to a seller without you having a lien. When you're buying new construction, the payments are made into a protected account against which you get a bank guarantee or an insurance policy. And the money is released to the contractor against building progress. So that's why, especially when you're buying new construction, you have the opportunity to prepay, because all the payments are insured and they can't just run away and do something with the property and never build it. They're only going to get, do something with the money and never build your property. They're only going to get the money out of the account against building progress. Okay. Additional costs. Let's go back to money. Linkage. You'll hear this word a lot, meaning madad. Madad comes into play when you are buying secondhand properties. What does that mean? It means that it's linked to the madad for building costs. That's a building index, which is meant to reflect the international price of building materials. And it means that slowly, your price will rise. So that is another reason why you need to have the opportunity to pay early, because if the madad is slowly rising and it's adding to your costs and you have the money and it's not making, and your money is not making any interest where it's invested, it might be worth it for you to put that money already into the purchase price and stop out the madad. So one of the things to look for in the madad is that you want the base madad, the base index, to be the index on the day, known on the day that you sign the contract, such that you're not already starting at a deficit. Sometimes you'll see that the madad is already from 5 months ago. And that means that if the madad's already gone up, your price has already gone up. So you want to have the base madad, the base index, be the madad known at the time that you sign the contract. The madad can only go one way, meaning that it will never go under the base, even if it drops. It just slowly goes up. So over 4 years, if you had a process that long, it definitely rises. And it's one reason why you should not budget to the end of your budget. You need to leave some breathing room to take into account that the price will rise according to the madad. Purchase tax, we went over. Legal fees are generally, an average is 1%. You'll see anything from, I don't know, 1/4%, don't go with those people, to 1.5% or 2%. Average is 1%, obviously, plus that. And honestly, my best piece of advice is you must go with someone that their primary field of expertise is property, because as you can see, I've been talking for 45 minutes and I could still talk for another 45 minutes. And people who don't do this as their primary field of expertise just don't know enough to look out for you. Agents' fees are generally average of 2% plus VAT, sometimes a little bit less, but you need to budget that in. So right now, again, you've got the linkage, purchase tax, which we gave you the average numbers, legal fees averaging 1, agents' fees averaging 2. The mortgage fees average, I would say, is 1% of the loan plus VAT, and small fees for an engineer, 1,500 shekels to 2,500 shekels, appraisal also a few thousand shekels, and then improvements or changes to the property. Especially changes or improvements comes into play when you're doing new construction, because again, oftentimes it's sold stripped or with not enough of a kitchen or missing some fundamental things that anyone would need in order to have the place be livable, like air conditioning or shower enclosure or window screens. All those kinds of things often do not show up in a spec list, and you need to understand what's missing so that you can make sure that you leave enough money aside. All of these soft costs that I just listed here on this page cannot be paid from mortgage money. So again, if you're going back to our wonderful example of 1,000,000 shekel and you are taking a 75% mortgage, if you only have 250,000 shekels in capital, you cannot buy that house because you don't have enough money to cover all of this stuff. You have to have enough for the down payment, plus all of the items that you would need outside of the purchase price. Okay, let me see if there's anything else on the list. Right, avoiding mistakes. Again, you want to build yourself a team. Who else can be on that team besides your attorney? You've got your agent that can look for a good property for you and help you negotiate sometimes. Your attorney, an appraiser, which can help you make sure that you're getting a good valuation and look up the planning, or a planning expert, an architect or a designer, and a mortgage broker, which again can really help you if you make sure that you take someone that's really got a good name and does more than just get you the approval. You want someone that really does the legwork for you and really helps you out and takes time to understand your situation. You need to write down all the agreements. Anything that's not written as far as the agreement doesn't exist. That's why the next piece is make all changes in writing. Do not miss your dates. You need to put reminders in all of your Outlook calendars or whatever calendar you're using that your tax needs to be paid in 60 days. If you have a payment and for that you're going to need a mortgage, you need to start that process at least 60 days before you need that mortgage. Mortgages cannot be done in a week. They take time. There's a whole set of documents. You go into the bank, you sign it. Some of the documents have to go to the seller. It's a time-consuming process. Your lawyer should kind of be your point person. They're the person that's going to coordinate all of these things and make sure that you're bringing in the right people at the right time. If you do not understand something, you need to ask. It is 100% your right and privilege to make sure that you know what you're getting into, that you're getting complete information and that you're making an informed decision. And the last piece is, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. Someone called me this week. He got this great apartment in Tel Aviv. It's 2 million something shekel. It's got this great view, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, except for it turns out that it's 1/4 of an illegally split apartment into 4. So there's a reason why it's affordable. It's because it's completely illegal. You can never get a mortgage. Selling it will be very difficult. There's no free rides, right? And it's not worth it for you to go through and buy something that's got a really big deficiency, because you never know at what point that you want to unload or you want to sell it, and now you're the person that's stuck trying to unload that property. I'm just gonna go back through my list of questions that I was asked and make sure. Okay, the expenses, I think I gave you a rundown, and again, I'll send out a flyer which has the list of expenses. You're welcome to email me and I can expand further on any of those. What are the benefits or downsides of buying on paper? I'm just going to spend a minute talking about this. The benefit is that it's new. So you have a lot less of the problems of buying an older, apartment with bad plumbing and stuff like that. And it does have a warranty on the work for timeframes which are set in the law. The entire apartment is under warranty for a year, and then there are 2-year timeframes, etc. However, the biggest thing about buying on paper is you must buy with a really reputable contractor, because all of the benefits of buying on paper, the warranty and the fact that it's new, etc., really only are benefits if you buy from a contractor that can stand behind the warranty. I have a client right now who bought from someone, and it turns out that the building is just shoddy. And so even though it's under warranty, the warranty is given by the same person who did the original shoddy building. So it's not so useful. So you need to make sure that you're buying from a really reputable contractor and do your homework. The benefits are that you can customize the house, especially the earlier you get in, the more they're going to be willing to make changes. If you buy something that's already mostly ready, they don't love to make changes, but you have the ability to make changes. Making changes is a process that you can do, again, after you sign the contract. You sit with the changes department, and there are 3 elements that really needs to be covered in any changes order. One is the scope of the work. What exactly are they doing for you? How much it's going to cost you? And the third most tricky little element is whether or not that's going to incur a delay in the possession time, which is a favorite trick of contractors, because they want to give themselves as much breathing room as possible in order to complete your apartment. The reason for that is if the contractor by law is more than 60 days late, not taking into account things like a war or you were late on your payments or something like that, they are meant to pay you compensation. So obviously they don't want to pay everyone in the building compensation. It's the amount of 1.5 times the rent for a similar apartment in that area. They don't want to pay that to everybody. So they look for all sorts of ways to stretch out the timeframes. As it is, they start with pretty elongated timeframes. And so if you move a plug from here to here, you'll sometimes see that they've added 6 weeks. So one thing when you're buying and you're making changes is you want to definitely take a look and make sure that they haven't slipped in there a delay in your timeframe. Okay, 5 more minutes and then we're gonna have to stop. Okay, how does registration work? When do I become the owner? Registration, again, you pay kind of in a layaway plan. You're paying the first payment against which you got against which you got a lien in a secondhand purchase, and you pay. You you make the final payment against keys. When you get keys, they give you the rest of the documents that we would need in order to transfer the title into your name. At the point that you pay the full amount, you are the owner, but the rights are not registered in your name yet. That usually takes a few months, depending on whether or not all of the necessary documents had been available, and there's mechanisms in the contract to allow for that. And once all of the documents have been, once all the rights have been transferred into your name, either in the minhal, which we spoke about earlier, or the construction company, the registration company, the Chavra Meshakenet, or the tabu, at that point you are the registered owner. But once you've paid the full price, you have full contractual rights and you are the owner. Okay, so how much of the purchase price do you need in order to take a mortgage? Again, minimum right now is 25%. And it really depends on your personal circumstances. Not everyone will qualify for a 75% mortgage, and that's what you would need to be getting approval for before you sign the contract. One thing about capital gains tax, which is a tax when you sell, that we were asked just to cover, and I'll cover that really quickly. As an Israeli resident owning a single property, like a sole residence, you are exempt from capital gains tax. If you have held the property for at least 18 months, you're a resident, this is your only property, and the exemption is for up to a ceiling of 4.5 million shekel. After that, you would be subject to tax, and the basic tax rate is 25% of the gain after deductions, and there's a few other scales that we can go into. There is no such thing as using the money, even if it's your 25th property and I move it and put it into a different 25th property, there's no other exemptions. That is the only exemption. If you are not a resident or you own more than one property, there is no exemption from capital gains tax in Israel. Okay, so that is basically the overview. There's a lot of material. There's obviously a million things that I didn't cover, but I hope that it kind of give you an overview. what you really need to do is just ask your questions and try to understand the process. Yair and I are available by email. After every webinar, we get a bunch of emails and we do our best to answer them. And I'm sure he's answered 115 questions in the last hour while I've been chatting with you. And feel free to make contact with us, and Josh will send out this PowerPoint and also the flyers that I have, which kind of just look at buying secondhand and then buying on paper.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Yair. Wow, you covered a lot of information. Professional and great as always. As I wrote in the chat, and I know Yair mentioned in a couple of the answers, we are having a session on January 20th dedicated specifically to the mortgage process. That will be up. I posted the link on the chat here. I will send it also in the email that we send out. So that is coming up in about a month. And with that, we will wrap it up. As Jane and Yair said, they're both available for follow-up questions. Their contact information will be included in the email. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great night.